A uniform, a badge, and a show of power set the stage for a confrontation no one expected, yet the man forced against his own car held a secret that would turn humiliation into reckoning. Witnesses captured every second, believing they were filming another abuse of authority, without realizing they were recording the beginning of a national turning point. This story holds a reveal that redefines power itself. Tap like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments about the plot and your location. Dr. David Carter carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime overcoming barriers built by prejudice. A black man who had risen to the pinnacle of federal law enforcement, he lived with the constant awareness that his skin color alone often invited suspicion in places where he rightfully belonged. On this evening, wearing a perfectly fitted navy suit and stepping out of his luxury Mercedes sedan, David was not FBI Director Carter to those watching. He was just another black man judged by his appearance, a man moments away from being stripped of his dignity in public view. As he locked his car and adjusted his cufflinks, a shout pierced the evening air. "Get your dirty hands off that car, boy." Officer Mark Reynolds, a white policeman known for his arrogance, had spotted him. With heavy boots pounding the pavement and eyes narrowed in contempt, Reynolds closed in quickly, carrying himself with the swagger of someone who believed his badge granted him the right to decide who did or didn't belong on that block. David turned calmly, knowing what was coming, but refusing to show fear. The shove came fast and hard. Reynolds slammed him onto the hood of the Mercedes, twisting his arm behind his back. The metallic thud reverberated off nearby buildings, drawing gasps from pedestrians who began to gather, phones lifted into the air. A teenager whispered to a friend that this would go viral, while a woman in a business suit muttered that it was too much. Yet Reynolds relished the spectacle. Stealing cars in broad daylight? He mocked loudly, ensuring the growing crowd could hear. Should have known better than to try that in this neighborhood. David winced under the pressure, but kept his voice even. "Officer, this is my vehicle. My identification and registration are in my wallet." Reynolds laughed cruelly, pressing harder, making a show of dominance. "Right, and I'm the FBI director," he sneered. "Hands behind your head." His voice dripped with sarcasm and racism. His tone meant not just to arrest, but to humiliate. The crowd murmured in disapproval, but no one stepped forward yet. David's silver watch caught the light as his hands pressed against the cold car roof, the shine of success mocked by the posture of submission. He remained calm on the outside, but inside he felt the sharp irony of the situation. For years, he had fought to reform the very abuses of power now being inflicted on him. He had pushed for body cameras, accountability, and oversight. Tonight, he was the living case study, an unwilling example of everything broken in the system he was trying to fix. Reynolds leaned close, spitting his words like venom. "You people think you can walk into these neighborhoods, drive cars you can't afford, act like you belong, but I notice. I always notice." The sentence cut deeper than the physical hold, confirming that this wasn't about crime. It was about race, about prejudice, about a white officer determined to put a black man back in his place. Phones kept recording. That night on the street when Dr. Blanc Senson's Gone Town, David Carter was humiliated by Officer Mark Reynolds, was not an accident of fate, but the collision of two lives moving on opposite paths, one of service and principle, the other of arrogance and prejudice. And to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding, the story must step back and reveal the worlds these two men lived in before they met under the glare of streetlights and cell phone cameras. Earlier that morning, David Carter had risen before dawn in his quiet Virginia home, a modest but elegant house filled with warmth and the reminders of a life well lived, family portraits lining the walls, images of his wife Angela and their two children smiling at graduations and birthdays, photographs of David shaking hands with past FBI directors, reminders of the long journey from a boy raised in a working-class black neighborhood to the highest position in federal law enforcement. His alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., and he moved with the discipline of habit, brewing coffee, checking headlines, pausing briefly when the news anchor spoke about federal police reform initiatives. Words David knew better than anyone because he had helped design those reforms himself. His tie was chosen carefully, his shoes shined, and before leaving he kissed his wife and promised not to work too late because their daughter had a recital the next day. A small moment of family life grounding the weight of his responsibilities. At the same time across town, Mark Reynolds was beginning his day in the precinct locker room, his words filled with resentment as he grumbled to his partner about federal oversight and body camera requirements, dismissing reforms as interference from bureaucrats who knew nothing about the streets. His locker was decorated with snapshots of young black men he had arrested, trophies of power rather than evidence of justice, and next to them sat a thick complaint file documenting years of abuse, force, and questionable arrests. A file that should have ended his career, but had been stalled and buried by a system that protected its own. Reynolds laughed with his colleagues, boasting about how he kept order his way, mocking oversight and ignoring the mounting evidence of misconduct, his contempt for the very rules that kept communities safe growing sharper with each word. David left FBI headquarters later that afternoon, moving through the corridors of power with humility, his office decorated with awards and commendations, but his nameplate turned slightly away from the door to avoid drawing attention, because he never wanted recognition for its own sake, only results, and as he reviewed briefing papers, he saw the grim statistics that haunted his every reform effort: arrest disparities, complaints ignored, evidence of systematic misconduct across precincts, data that painted a picture of bias in black and white. His secretary reminded him of his community engagement at 6 o'clock, and he nodded, closing a file labeled Metropolitan Police Reform Initiative Phase 2, a plan that, if successful, would change the relationship between citizens and police nationwide. Before leaving, he texted Angela, reassuring her he would be home for their daughter's recital, a promise made with genuine love, even as he prepared to carry the weight of systemic reform on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Reynolds spent his afternoon prowling neighborhoods, targeting luxury cars driven by black professionals, ignoring dispatch calls for real emergencies, satisfied instead by intimidating men who looked like David Carter, but without the federal power that shielded him. In 3 hours, Reynolds stopped 4 vehicles, each time prolonging the stop, searching cars, interrogating drivers, releasing them only when no excuse remained to detain them further. The night on 5th Street was never meant to be extraordinary for Dr. Blank's fifth. David Carter, who believed he was simply carrying forward his duty to listen, to observe, and to understand the voices of the community he had dedicated his career to protecting. But the convergence of his disciplined life and Officer Mark Reynolds' prejudice was inevitable, for every decision both men had made earlier that day had guided them to the same corner of Washington, D.C., the same moment where appearance and assumption would crash into each other. David drove away from FBI headquarters at precisely 5:30 p.m., the same time he always left when he promised his family he would be home for dinner, but tonight his route was different. Tonight he was not heading home to the quiet warmth of his Virginia house, but toward the downtown community center where a forum on police trust and accountability would be held. A forum where he had chosen to participate not as Director Carter, but as an anonymous federal official listening to ordinary voices. He preferred it this way, to slip into rooms and hear citizens speak without the intimidation of his title, without the barrier of his authority, because he believed real reform began with hearing unfiltered truth. He knew the faces of mothers who had lost sons to unjust stops, fathers denied dignity in front of their children, professionals humiliated in their own neighborhoods, and he carried their stories with him every time he crafted a new policy, every time he fought to tighten oversight, every time he pressed Congress for stronger accountability. Across town, Officer Reynolds had been prowling his chosen neighborhoods with the same sense of entitlement that had guided his career for years, pulling over cars not because of erratic driving or valid suspicion, but because the drivers were black men whose very success provoked his disdain, a disdain sharpened into hostility by his belief that men like David Carter could never belong in the spaces they occupied. Reynolds had stopped 4 vehicles in less than 3 hours, each time drawing out the encounter, ordering drivers to step aside, searching without probable cause, questioning with hostility, and each time letting them go without a citation because nothing was there. But to him, the absence of evidence was not proof of innocence. It was proof that he had not dug deep enough, and he told himself that one day he would catch one of them, that he would find the evidence to confirm his bias. His resentment grew when dispatch reminded all officers to check their body cameras because he despised oversight, despised accountability, despised anything that limited his control. But with supervisors checking compliance, he grudgingly switched it on, unaware that in doing so, he had condemned himself, because this night would be different. This night his arrogance would be exposed in full detail from multiple angles. David parked outside the community center, 15 minutes early as always, because punctuality was another form of respect, another way of showing that the voices waiting inside mattered. And as he turned off the engine and reached for his notes, he glanced at his watch and thought briefly of Angela and their daughter's recital, promising himself again that he would not stay too late. The center across the street buzzed with early arrivals, community leaders and citizens filtering in, hopeful that tonight their voices would be heard, hopeful that someone in power would care enough to act, and David intended to be that someone, though they would not know it yet. He stepped out of the Mercedes, adjusted his tie, and locked the door, standing tall in his suit, the picture of a black professional who had earned his success through relentless perseverance. At that same moment, Reynolds's patrol car turned the corner, and his eyes locked immediately onto the scene that triggered every prejudice he carried. A black man in a luxury sedan, confident posture, expensive suit, standing outside a building in an upscale neighborhood. To Reynolds, this was not the image of success, but the image of suspicion, because in his worldview, blackness and wealth could not coexist without crime, and as his hands gripped the wheel and his jaw tightened, his decision was made. He would make this man an example. He would show the gathered pedestrians and the city itself that he, Officer Mark Reynolds, controlled who belonged and who did not. He parked abruptly, the squeal of brakes drawing attention, and stepped out with a performance already in mind, his body language aggressive, his eyes narrowed, his voice ready to humiliate. David noticed him immediately, his instincts honed by decades of service alerting him to the danger, but he did not flinch, he did not retreat, because retreat was never his way, and though he hoped the encounter might be resolved with reason, he knew better. He knew the script of suspicion written long before he stepped into his suit that morning. The crowd on the sidewalk paused, curiosity shifting into unease as they saw the officer approach with heavy steps, as they saw the black man in the suit standing still by his car. Officer Mark Reynolds had already decided what story he wanted to tell when he stepped out of his patrol car and marched toward Dr. Pless. David Carter, the black man standing tall beside his luxury sedan, and though David remained calm with the poise of someone who had endured this kind of suspicion before, Reynolds came forward with the aggression of a man performing for an audience, because by now the crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion, phones raised, eyes watching, and Reynolds, intoxicated by the attention, was determined to humiliate. He grabbed David by the arm without hesitation, yanking his wallet from his suit jacket as though the man before him were already guilty, already stripped of rights, and he held the leather wallet up theatrically, pulling out the license and sneering as he read aloud, "Dr. David Carter." He said the title, Doctor, with exaggerated mockery, his voice dripping with sarcasm, as if the idea of a black man holding an advanced degree was a joke meant for the crowd. "Oh look, a doctor," he announced loudly, making sure the surrounding pedestrians could hear. "Must have bought this online, right?" "Probably forged." His laughter echoed against the brick buildings, and a murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. David, still pressed against the car, turned his head slightly and spoke with measured authority. "Officer, you are escalating a situation unnecessarily. This is my vehicle. My identification is valid. If you run it, you'll see it matches this car and my address in Fairfax County." Reynolds' smirk widened as he held the ID to the light like a counterfeit bill, mocking even the idea of verification. "Fairfax County, huh? Real fancy neighborhood. No way someone like you lives there legitimately." His words carried the coded venom of prejudice, not subtle, not hidden, but loud enough to tell everyone exactly what he thought, and the crowd reacted, some gasping, others muttering with disgust. A woman in business attire shouted, "That's excessive. He told you it's his car." But Reynolds waved her off with a bark, "Step back or you'll be arrested for obstruction." More phones appeared, more people recording, and though David felt humiliation pressing against him like the officer's weight, he also felt a grim reassurance. The truth was being documented. Evidence was piling up, undeniable, unavoidable, and though tonight was a nightmare, it could also become a reckoning. Reynolds, however, fed off the attention like fuel. He twisted David's arm higher, forcing him to wince, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, "You people think you can waltz into nice neighborhoods, steal cars, and nobody notices. Well, I notice everything." His words carried across the street like a proclamation, his arrogance unshaken, even as the crowd grew restless. That was when another patrol car pulled up, and Officer Luis Perez stepped out, his brow furrowed as he approached. Perez was Latino, younger, less jaded, and he immediately sensed something was wrong. The man pinned against the car was not behaving like a car thief. His suit was immaculate, his watch expensive, his demeanor calm and professional even under duress. Perez's instincts told him this was not a routine arrest, and his eyes widened further when he saw papers scattered near the car door, pages from a briefcase that had been tossed aside during Reynolds' aggressive search. Perez stepped closer, recognizing federal seals and official letterhead on the documents, and a cold unease settled in his stomach. "Mark," Perez said cautiously, lowering his voice, "maybe we should slow this down. Something doesn't feel right here." Reynolds snapped his head toward him, eyes flashing with annoyance. "Don't go soft on me now. This guy was stealing a Mercedes, and I'm handling it." Officer Mark Reynolds had already gone too far, but arrogance and prejudice do not retreat when an audience is watching. They double down, and as David Carter stood pressed against the hood of his own Mercedes, with the crowd murmuring louder and louder, and Officer Luis Perez holding documents that hinted at federal authority, Reynolds made the decision that would seal his fate, because humiliation alone was not enough for him. He needed evidence, he needed a trophy to parade before the public and his colleagues, and he needed it to confirm the story he had already written in his mind, the story of a black man in a nice car who had to be dirty. David felt Reynolds' hands probing through his jacket, yanking papers out and tossing them on the ground. But his focus remained calm, his breathing steady, even as his shoulder burned with pain, because inside he was watching, calculating, remembering every second that would matter later when truth was revealed. The crowd was restless now, their phones recording from every angle, a teenager whispering to her friend that this was going to explode online, a businesswoman shouting again for Reynolds to stop, and Perez shifting uneasily with the letterhead in his hand, recognizing that the man being humiliated was no ordinary professional. But Reynolds ignored all of it, his contempt for oversight fueling him to create the lie he needed. With a smooth motion that came from practice, Reynolds palmed a small plastic bag from his utility belt, a bag he had used many times before in other encounters where suspicion wasn't enough and evidence needed to appear, and with the confidence of repetition he bent down and slipped it under the driver's seat of the Mercedes, his body blocking the crowd's view, his movements concealed by the chaos he had created. He straightened quickly, his hand lifting triumphantly, holding the bag aloft like a prize. "Well, well, well, what do we have here?" His voice carried across the street, dripping with false triumph. "Cocaine, felony possession with intent to distribute." Gasps erupted from the crowd, some in disbelief, others in fury, because many had seen enough already to suspect what he had done, and Perez's face tightened as he watched, his heart pounding with the certainty that this was staged. David turned his head slightly, his eyes locking on the nearest phone camera, his voice clear and unwavering despite the pain. "Officer, that substance is not mine, and you know exactly where it came from. Everyone here, record everything you see, document every word. The truth will come out." His tone was firm, steady, commanding, not of a criminal caught in a lie, but of a man with authority, and the crowd erupted in louder shouts, some yelling, "We saw you plant that," others demanding Reynolds let him go. Reynolds, unfazed, smirked at the outrage, feeding on it like oxygen. "They never say it's theirs," he mocked, waving the bag for emphasis. "Cocaine doesn't just fall out of the sky into luxury vehicles. This is a real good arrest, folks. Career criminal caught red-handed." He savored the words, convinced that his performance was airtight, convinced that his authority was untouchable, blind to the shifting tide around him. Perez stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. "Mark, we need to test that before we charge anything. This doesn't look right." Reynolds spun on him, fury flashing in his eyes. "Test it? What's to test? Drugs are drugs. Don't go soft on me now." He turned back to the crowd, spreading his arms like an actor basking in applause. David's humiliation was complete in the physical sense, but internally his resolve burned brighter. The metal handcuffs clicked shut around Dr. David Carter's wrists with a cold finality that seemed to echo louder than the shouts of the crowd, and though his face remained calm, his dignity was being stripped away in front of strangers. Each second recorded on dozens of phones, each image searing humiliation into the public record. Officer Mark Reynolds, swollen with arrogance, yanked David upright and pushed him toward the patrol car with deliberate force, his voice carrying above the rising chorus of outrage as he barked warnings at the onlookers to step back or face arrest themselves. The crowd did not retreat. Instead, they followed, their anger intensifying, some demanding badge numbers, others shouting that they would contact attorneys and news outlets, and more than one person calling out that they had seen Reynolds plant the drugs. But Reynolds thrived on confrontation, convinced that his authority was untouchable, and as he shoved David into the backseat of the squad car, he smirked for the cameras, mocking with false politeness. "Watch your head, doctor? Wouldn't want you to get hurt before your court date." The door slammed shut, and David sat quietly behind the glass, his posture straight, his eyes sharp, refusing to allow the cuffs or the taunts to rob him of self-respect. He knew that every humiliating second was being captured, and he also knew his silence and composure were more powerful than any protest, because soon the truth would demand attention. Officer Luis Perez climbed reluctantly into the passenger seat, his hands trembling as he fastened his belt, his mind replaying the sight of the federal documents scattered on the ground and the unmistakable authority in David's voice. "Mark, we need to call the supervisor before we process this. Something isn't right," he said carefully, but Reynolds brushed him off with scorn. "What isn't right is you questioning a textbook arrest. Stolen vehicle, felony possession, resisting arrest. It's Christmas morning, Perez." Perez swallowed his protests, staring at the man in the back seat whose calm eyes did not match the behavior of any suspect he had ever encountered. David said nothing, but inside his mind was methodical, running through protocol, knowing that when his phone calls went unanswered, his staff would initiate emergency measures. Deputy Director Rachel Monroe would already be aware that something was wrong, and within minutes his location would be traced. Back at the precinct, word was spreading in whispers. Desk Sergeant William Harris had caught sight of the new detainee during booking preparation and nearly dropped his clipboard because he had seen that face at federal conferences, seen it on official communications, and he knew exactly who sat in the back of Reynolds' patrol car. His lips went dry, his voice faltered as he quietly called for the watch commander. "Make sure holding cells are clean, and get me Commander Thomas Miller right now," he whispered urgently to a fellow officer, his stomach twisting with dread at the realization of what Reynolds had done. As the squad car pulled into the precinct parking lot, Reynolds strutted with pride, pulling David roughly by the arm as though parading a trophy, announcing loudly to anyone within earshot, "Got ourselves a real prize tonight, boys. Car thief with a drug habit and a fancy vocabulary." David moved with measured steps, his cuffs biting into his wrists, yet his head was high, his eyes steady, and his presence unsettled the booking staff, who exchanged nervous glances as he provided his information in clear, even tones. When asked for his occupation, he said simply, "Federal law enforcement." Reynolds burst out laughing, his voice booming across the room. "Federal law enforcement? What are you, a security guard at the post office?" These people always inflate their job titles. But Sergeant Harris, standing nearby, felt the blood drain from his face because he knew that the title was not inflated, it was the truth, and every word Reynolds spoke was digging a deeper hole. During fingerprinting, David exercised his right to a phone call, and Reynolds, with malicious satisfaction, escorted him to the desk phone, unlocking the cuffs briefly. David dialed from memory, his voice calm but precise as someone answered. "This is Director Carter. I am in custody at the 5th Precinct. Implement Protocol 7 immediately." The sergeant nearby nearly choked on his coffee because Protocol 7 was reserved for the gravest emergencies involving high-ranking federal officials. Reynolds snatched the phone away, sneering, "Time's up, hotshot. Back to your cell." As David was led to holding, other detainees looked up, their surprise evident at the sight of a man in a suit being treated like a criminal. One asked quietly, "What are you in for?" And David replied with quiet authority, "A misunderstanding that's about to become very expensive for some people." Outside the precinct, black SUVs with government plates screeched to a halt, and federal agents in dark suits poured out, their movements sharp, purposeful, expressions grim. Commander Thomas Miller's office was tense with an unease that spread through the walls of the precinct like a rising storm, and though the corridors outside bustled with the sudden arrival of black SUVs and federal agents in dark suits, Inside, Miller stood behind his desk, pale and trembling, as he read the arrest report that bore the name of the man currently locked in holding cell number 3, the name that froze his blood, Dr. David Carter. He barely had time to steady his hands when the door opened, and in swaggered Officer Mark Reynolds, his uniform crisp, his smirk wide, his confidence radiating off him as though he expected applause. Behind him trailed Officer Luis Perez, quieter, his face tight with dread, the memory of federal seals on scattered documents still gnawing at his conscience. "You wanted to see me, Commander?" Reynolds said with his usual cocky grin, ready to recount his version of the arrest, convinced it would cement his reputation as the precinct's boldest officer. But his grin faltered the moment his eyes met the people standing inside Miller's office. Deputy Director Rachel Monroe of the FBI and 3 federal agents with badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights, their expressions a blend of fury and restraint. The air felt heavier, each breath weighted with consequence. Miller's voice cracked as he asked, "Officer Reynolds, do you want to tell me exactly who you arrested tonight?" Reynolds' smirk returned briefly as he shrugged. "Some car thief with delusions of grandeur. Called himself a doctor, claimed he worked for the federal government. Classic criminal behavior, inflate the resume, hope for leniency." Monroe stepped forward then, her presence commanding, her voice ice cold, each syllable cutting into the room like a blade. "Officer Reynolds, allow me to introduce myself. I am Deputy Director Rachel Monroe of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the man you arrested tonight is not a thief, not a fraud, and not a liar. He is my boss. He is Director David Carter, the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the United States." The words struck Reynolds like a physical blow, his confidence evaporating, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, as though trying to shape a denial that would not come. Perez shut his eyes briefly and whispered under his breath, a silent prayer of dread confirmed. "That's impossible," Reynolds stammered finally, his voice shaky. "He was stealing a car. I found drugs." One of the federal agents, Agent Morrison, stepped forward, holding a tablet, and with a swipe of his finger brought up footage from Reynolds' own body camera, from Perez's, and from at least a dozen cell phone videos collected from bystanders already uploading clips online. The screen displayed crystal-clear evidence, Reynolds' hand palming the baggie from his belt, slipping it under the seat, and then triumphantly holding it up as if it were discovered. The angle was undeniable, the intent obvious. "We watched you," Morrison said flatly, his voice heavy with disgust. "You planted the evidence. Every second is documented from multiple sources. You didn't just arrest an innocent man, you humiliated the director of the FBI on a public street, in full view of citizens who captured your corruption for the entire nation to see." Reynolds staggered back a step, his legs unsteady, his hands reaching instinctively for the chair behind him as though it might hold him upright. His face drained of color, sweat beading at his temples. I didn't know," he whispered, his words trembling. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Monroe shot back, her voice rising, the fury barely contained. "You saw a black man in an expensive car and your prejudice did the thinking for you. You mocked his name, sneered at his credentials, dismissed his neighborhood, and framed him with false evidence. Your arrogance blinded you so completely that you never stopped to ask if your assumptions matched reality." Miller found his own voice then, though it shook with both fear and anger. "Officer Reynolds, you are suspended immediately, pending a full federal investigation, badge and weapon now." The command stripped Reynolds of his last illusion of control. His hands shook as he unclipped the badge from his chest, the metal heavier than it had ever felt, and set it on Miller's desk with a dull thud that echoed like the closing of a cell door. His service weapon followed, and in that moment he looked less like an officer of the law and more like the criminal he had tried to fabricate. "Where is Director Carter now?" Monroe demanded, her tone sharp. "Holding cell number 3, Miller whispered, his shame heavy, his eyes unable to meet hers. "Get him out immediately, remove those cuffs, and deliver a formal apology." Monroe snapped, and Miller rushed out of the office with 2 agents at his side. Reynolds sank into the chair, his chest heaving, his arrogance replaced by terror. "Do you understand what you've done?" Monroe continued, stepping closer, her eyes burning with fury. "You didn't just insult a man, you insulted the principle of justice itself. The man you targeted has spent his career fighting misconduct like yours. He is the architect of the very reforms you mocked this afternoon." Body cameras, oversight, accountability, they were his initiatives, and you just proved exactly why they are necessary. Perez finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Ma'am, I tried to stop him. I saw the documents, I recognized the authority, I told him something was wrong." Monroe turned to him, her expression still stern but slightly softer. "Your actions will be reviewed, Officer Perez, but the record shows you attempted to intervene. That will be taken into account." The footsteps of returning agents echoed down the hall, and then the door opened, revealing David Carter walking into the office, his cuffs removed, his wrists rubbed raw but his posture unbroken, his presence commanding even in silence. The room went still, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound, and Reynolds, pale and shaking, could not lift his eyes to meet the man he had humiliated. Monroe approached David with respect. "Director Carter, are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" David shook his head, his voice low but steady. "I'm fine, Rachel, but we have work to do." He turned then toward Reynolds, his gaze sharp, his authority unmistakable. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice calm yet firm enough to command every ear in the room. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, Reynolds raised his eyes, his face a mask of shame and fear. "Do you understand what happened here tonight?" David continued. "You didn't just arrest an innocent man. You exposed a systemic problem that runs deeper than one officer's prejudice. Your actions tonight are a case study in everything that is broken in modern policing." Reynolds' lips quivered as he stammered, "Director, I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were." David's response cut sharper than any reprimand, his words ringing with truth. "That is exactly the problem. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic human dignity. You shouldn't need to see my badge to follow procedure. And you should never need my authority to keep you from planting false evidence." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of reckoning. Monroe stepped forward, her voice cold once again. "Officer Reynolds, you will face federal civil rights charges, evidence tampering charges, and a full civil investigation. Tonight was the end of your career, and soon it will be the beginning of your sentence." Reynolds' head dropped, the reality of his downfall crushing him at last. And in that room, the humiliation shifted, the balance of power reversed. The victim revealed as the most powerful law enforcement official in the nation, the aggressor reduced to a disgraced man awaiting justice, and the entire system forced to confront itself in the mirror of a single night's actions. The weight of the room shifted the instant Dr. Center senescent. David Carter stood unshackled before Officer Mark Reynolds, the black man who had been humiliated only minutes earlier now commanding every ounce of authority in the precinct, and though the handcuff marks still reddened his wrists, his posture was tall, his gaze unwavering, his voice steady with a calm that carried more power than shouting ever could. Deputy Director Rachel Monroe had already outlined the federal charges Reynolds would face. Commander Miller had already stripped him of badge and weapon, but it was David's presence that brought silence, a silence filled with the gravity of what had just happened. He took a single step forward, his eyes locked on Reynolds, who sat slumped in the chair, sweat on his brow, his arrogance shattered. "Officer Reynolds," David began, his voice calm yet commanding, "look at me." Slowly Reynolds lifted his eyes, his lips trembling, his expression a mix of fear and shame. "Do you understand what happened here tonight?" David continued. "You didn't just arrest an innocent man. You exposed every broken piece of a system that allowed you to operate unchecked, every assumption you made rooted not in evidence or law but in prejudice, and every decision you took without accountability." Reynolds' voice cracked as he stammered, "Director, I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were." David shook his head firmly, his words precise. "That is exactly the problem. You should never need to know who I am to treat me with basic dignity. You should never need to see my badge to follow proper procedure. And you should never rely on your authority to justify planting evidence and abusing your power." His words struck like blows, each one piercing the illusion Reynolds had clung to for years. Monroe and the agents remained silent, their eyes fixed on the exchange, because it was more than personal, it was systemic, and the truth was being spoken by the man who had lived the injustice and carried the responsibility to fix it. Reynolds opened his mouth, but no excuse came. He was stripped bare, and even Perez, standing to the side, could not look at him without feeling disgust at what he had witnessed. Commander Miller cleared his throat, and announced that Reynolds would be escorted to federal holding immediately, his suspension immediate, his career over. Two agents stepped forward, placing hands on Reynolds' shoulders, and though he resisted for a moment with a desperate shake of his head, the fight was gone from him. The sight of the same badge he had mocked now hanging heavy on Miller's desk was a symbol of how quickly arrogance could collapse. As Reynolds was led out of the room, David turned to Perez, his eyes softening slightly. "You knew something was wrong," David said. Perez nodded, speaking quietly. "I tried to slow him down, sir. I saw the documents. I knew this wasn't right." Monroe interjected firmly. "Your actions will be reviewed separately. You may have prevented this disaster from spiraling further." David inclined his head slightly toward Perez, recognizing the importance of even small moments of conscience in a system that often punished silence and rewarded complicity. With Reynolds gone, David addressed the room more broadly. What happened tonight cannot be dismissed as one bad officer. It is the symptom of something far larger, something that infects trust between law enforcement and the communities we are sworn to serve. Every assumption made about me was rooted in the color of my skin. My education, my profession, my character, my right to drive my own car, all of it dismissed because of prejudice. His words carried across the room, and no one dared to interrupt. Even Miller, who had built his career managing the daily chaos of a precinct, felt the sting of shame because he knew the complaint file on Reynolds' conduct had sat ignored for years. The reversal of power was complete. David Carter, who had been shoved against his car and mocked in public, now stood as the most powerful law enforcement officer in the nation, and Reynolds, once swaggering with arrogance, was in federal custody awaiting charges. But David did not gloat, did not revel in revenge. His calm, deliberate tone made it clear that this was not about personal victory, but about accountability. Monroe outlined the next steps, explaining that federal civil rights charges, tampering charges, and obstruction charges would be filed, and that every arrest Reynolds had made over the past 2 years would be re-examined by federal investigators. David nodded, his mind already shifting from humiliation to reform. "This cannot end with one man's punishment," he said firmly. "It must begin with systemic change. Body cameras, mandatory review of evidence, oversight with teeth, not paperwork that gets buried. If this precinct ignored complaints for years, then it is part of the problem, and I will ensure it becomes part of the solution." His words carried a gravity that resonated with everyone present because they knew the truth of it. Perez exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing as though a weight had been lifted, and even Miller, still pale and shaken, nodded in agreement. The news was spreading already. Outside the precinct, crowds had gathered as federal SUVs and agents signaled that something monumental had occurred. Reporters were arriving, microphones ready, cameras flashing, and though David did not seek spectacle, he knew this night would become a national story. Inside, Monroe asked softly, "Sir, would you like to leave quietly through the back?" David shook his head, his voice steady. "No, we don't hide from this, not tonight." When he stepped into the lobby, the chatter erupted into silence, every eye turning toward him, phones raised high. He raised his hands slightly, the faint red marks of the cuffs visible, and spoke clearly for all to hear. "What you witnessed tonight was wrong. It was not justice, but it will not be ignored. We will hold those responsible accountable, and we will change the system that allowed it." Applause broke out, raw and emotional, from those who had been waiting anxiously outside, many of them the same people who had filmed his humiliation earlier. The reversal was not just about power, it was about hope, the possibility that truth could still cut through arrogance, that accountability could still follow abuse, that dignity could be restored. As he left the precinct, escorted by federal agents not as a prisoner, but as their leader, David Carter carried with him the knowledge that tonight's ordeal had given the nation a story too powerful to dismiss. The reversal was complete, the roles had shifted, and the man who had been mocked as a thief was revealed as the nation's top defender of justice. The arrest of Dr. David Carter had shifted from a single officer's arrogance into a national reckoning, and the reversal of power that occurred in the precinct was only the beginning because Carter, now fully revealed as the FBI director, had no intention of letting the matter end with the disgrace of Officer Mark Reynolds. Instead, he directed the weight of federal authority toward uncovering the depth of misconduct that Reynolds' actions represented, And in the hours following his release, the FBI field office buzzed with activity at a level rarely seen outside counterterrorism operations. Dozens of agents huddled over monitors, analysts compiled evidence, and prosecutors were briefed as Carter himself sat at a central table reviewing body camera footage with the calm intensity of a surgeon, his jaw tight but his voice precise as he instructed his team. Every second of the video confirmed what witnesses had shouted on the street. Reynolds had planted evidence, mocked an innocent man, and escalated force without justification. But what disturbed Carter most was not his own humiliation. It was the realization that Reynolds' conduct had gone unchecked for years, protected by a culture of silence and a chain of command that ignored warning signs. Carter ordered an immediate review of Reynolds' arrest history, demanding statistical analysis of every traffic stop, every complaint, and every case file. Within hours, the numbers painted a horrifying picture. Out of 847 arrests Reynolds had made in 5 years, 723 involved black men between the ages of 18 and 55, an 85% rate in a district where the black population was only 31%. The data was not coincidence. It was proof of racial targeting. Even more damning was the discovery that 89% of Reynolds' drug charges had been dismissed or reduced in court because of lack of evidence or procedural misconduct. To Carter, the implication was clear. Reynolds had not stumbled into misconduct, he had built a career on it, and the system had let him. As Carter absorbed these statistics, Deputy Director Monroe entered with a stack of victim testimonies that had already begun to pour in since the news broke. Social media had exploded with outrage, videos of the arrest going viral within hours, and people who had endured similar encounters with Reynolds were stepping forward. One testimony described a prominent surgeon, Dr. Michael Thompson, who had been arrested outside his hospital after a 16-hour shift because Reynolds claimed he looked suspicious. Thompson had missed critical surgeries the next morning. Patients left without the doctor who had saved hundreds of lives. Another file described Professor James Washington, a tenured professor at Georgetown, who had been pulled over 17 times by Reynolds in 2 years, never charged but always humiliated, forced to prove over and over that he belonged on the streets near campus. Carter read each account with growing anger, the words pressing on him like weights, each story a reminder that behind the numbers were lives disrupted, reputations stained, children traumatized. He instructed Monroe to expand the investigation beyond Reynolds, demanding that every officer with similar statistical patterns be flagged, every complaint previously dismissed reopened. Agents identified at least a dozen other officers with arrest histories echoing Reynolds' profile, and Carter immediately authorized a sweeping federal probe. He understood the danger of allowing misconduct to be dismissed as the work of one bad officer. He intended to prove it was systemic. Meanwhile, Reynolds sat in federal holding, stripped of his uniform, his arrogance collapsed, his mind racing with the realization that the very body camera he had despised had become the instrument of his downfall. He was interrogated by federal agents who presented him with evidence not only from the arrest of Carter, but from dozens of past cases. The walls of denial he tried to construct crumbled quickly under the weight of video, forensic evidence, and testimony. When Carter himself entered the interrogation room 3 days later, wearing the suit that symbolized both his dignity and his authority, the balance of power was undeniable. "State your name and former occupation for the record," Carter began, his voice calm, professional, but carrying an edge of steel. "Mark Reynolds, former police officer, 5th Precinct, Metropolitan Police Department," came the weak reply, Reynolds' voice barely audible. Carter leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Reynolds' face. "Do you understand why you are here?" Reynolds swallowed hard and muttered, "Because I arrested you without knowing who you were." Carter's reply was sharp and unyielding. "No. You are here because you systematically violated the civil rights of American citizens for years. My federal position is irrelevant. You would have done the same thing to a janitor, a teacher, a student, a father. Isn't that correct?" Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, until Carter opened a thick folder and began listing names. Marcus Williams, arrested outside his law office. Kevin Davis, arrested while loading groceries into his own car. Antonio Martinez, arrested for possession during a stop with no violation recorded. Each name was a story, each story a wound, and Carter forced Reynolds to confront them one by one. Reynolds tried to defend himself weakly. muttering that he had been trying to protect the community, but Carter's voice cut through his excuses. Protect the community? You weren't protecting anyone. You appointed yourself judge and jury, and when your prejudice told you someone was guilty, you manufactured evidence to make it so. That is not law enforcement, that is criminal behavior. For 3 hours, Carter pressed, relentless but composed, drawing admissions, breaking down denials, exposing patterns of misconduct. By the end, Reynolds slumped in his chair, his voice trembling as he whispered, "I made mistakes. I shouldn't have done it." Carter stood, straightened his jacket, and delivered the words that closed the session. "Your mistakes destroyed lives, families, and trust in law enforcement itself. You will be held accountable. And this nation will use your actions as a case study in why reform is not optional but essential." Outside the interrogation room, Carter briefed Monroe and the prosecutors. He ordered that every case connected to Reynolds be re-examined, wrongful convictions overturned, and restitution provided to victims. He demanded policy recommendations to prevent similar misconduct, stricter evidence handling, mandatory review of racial disparities, expanded civilian oversight boards. The investigation expanded daily, its scope unprecedented. The story dominated national news, sparking protests, community forums, and urgent debates in Congress. Civil rights organizations praised Carter's courage for exposing the injustice publicly rather than quietly resolving his own humiliation. Even some police unions, faced with undeniable footage, acknowledged the need for reform. Within weeks, federal prosecutors announced charges against Reynolds, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy under color of law. His trial would become one of the most significant in decades, a public examination not only of one man's misconduct, but of the culture that allowed it. For David Carter, the investigation was more than punishment, it was transformation. The humiliation he had endured on the street had been turned into the catalyst for national reform, and though the wounds on his wrists healed quickly, the memory of that night burned as a reminder of why his fight mattered. The investigation was no longer about one man. It was about a system, and for the first time in years, there was hope that the system might change. 6 months after the night Dr. David Carter had been humiliated in front of strangers and cameras on a Washington, D.C. street, the federal courthouse was filled to capacity, every bench taken by victims, reporters, community leaders, and citizens who had followed every detail of the investigation that had begun with a false arrest and grown into a nationwide reckoning. At the defendant's table sat Mark Reynolds, no longer the swaggering officer who had strutted through the precinct boasting of his victory, but a hollowed man in an orange jumpsuit, his hair disheveled, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling as he awaited his fate. His defense attorney had argued for leniency, pointing to his cooperation once confronted with overwhelming evidence, pointing to the fact that his testimony had helped expose other officers and contributed to the overturning of dozens of wrongful convictions. But the prosecution, armed with meticulous evidence compiled under Carter's direct supervision, argued that the magnitude of his misconduct demanded accountability. Judge Patricia Williams, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, began her remarks with a gravity that silenced the courtroom. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice measured yet stern, "in 3 decades of presiding over cases, I have rarely seen such a sustained pattern of abuse of power. You violated the rights of the very citizens you were sworn to protect, you planted evidence, you falsified reports, and you targeted individuals based on prejudice rather than law. Your actions did not only harm individuals, they corroded trust in law enforcement itself." She gestured toward the gallery, where victims sat shoulder to shoulder, men and women who had endured Reynolds' misconduct. Dr. Michael Thompson, the surgeon who had been arrested outside his own hospital, sat with his arms crossed, but his head high. Professor James Washington sat beside him, nodding firmly, his students having once petitioned for his safety. Attorney David Johnson held the hands of his twin daughters, now 9 years old, their eyes wide as they watched the man who had once handcuffed their father in front of them finally face justice. Judge Williams continued, her tone sharpening. "Your defense has argued that you cooperated once confronted, but cooperation after exposure does not erase the damage you inflicted. Justice requires more than words, it requires accountability." The courtroom waited as she delivered the sentence. "You will serve 8 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will pay restitution to the victims in the amount of $347,000. And you are permanently barred from holding any position in law enforcement. Gasps rippled through the gallery, not of shock but of relief, a release of breath long held, the sound of justice long delayed but finally delivered. Reynolds bowed his head, his body shaking, and the guards moved to escort him out, his orange-clad figure a stark contrast to the polished uniform he had once abused. In the front row, David Carter sat silently, his expression calm, his heart steady. He had testified extensively during the trial, presenting evidence with the same composure he had shown on the night of his humiliation, and his words had carried more weight than any accusation. He had refused to let the trial become about his personal dignity alone. He had insisted it remain about systemic reform. The courtroom recordings of his confrontation with Reynolds had already become required viewing in police academies across the country, a chilling lesson in how prejudice can blind and power can corrupt. Outside the courthouse, Carter addressed the gathered press with deliberate words. Today's sentence is not the end of a story, it is the beginning of change. Accountability must not end with one man. It must extend to every precinct, every policy, every system that allows misconduct to thrive. Justice is not about punishment alone. It is about transformation. His words resonated across television screens and live streams, replayed by commentators and shared by citizens who had witnessed the viral videos of his arrest months earlier. Communities across the nation began to see the case not only as a scandal but as a watershed moment, proof that even the most powerful could be targeted by prejudice, but also proof that truth, once exposed, could not be denied. In the months that followed, the reforms Carter had championed accelerated with unprecedented momentum. Congress passed the Federal Police Accountability Act, mandating body cameras for all departments receiving federal funding, creating a national database of misconduct, and establishing federal oversight boards to intervene when patterns of civil rights violations emerged. In 17 cities, civilian review boards were expanded with real authority, and use of force incidents dropped by nearly half within the first year. Complaints were processed more quickly, oversight grew sharper, and most importantly, communities once silenced began to speak again. At the first annual Police Accountability Summit held in the very community center where Carter had been arrested, hundreds gathered: police chiefs, civil rights leaders, professors, clergy, and ordinary citizens. Carter stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd that included many of the victims of Reynolds' misconduct, now advocates for reform. Dr. Thompson had established a foundation to provide legal aid to victims of police abuse. Professor Washington was developing curricula for bias recognition training. Johnson's daughters had written letters to police academies about dignity and respect, their words circulating far beyond their school. Officer Luis Perez, who had once hesitated on that street but had tried to intervene, now promoted to a supervisory role, was tasked with leading training programs on integrity and intervention, teaching recruits that silence in the face of misconduct was complicity. As Carter addressed the summit, he reminded them, systematic change does not happen overnight. It happens when citizens refuse to remain silent, when officers refuse to look away, when leaders refuse to excuse misconduct as the act of one bad apple. What happened to me was personal, yes, but it is not unique. It is part of a pattern that must be broken. And we will break it. The audience rose in applause, not for the man but for the message, for the possibility that dignity and justice might coexist, that reform might replace cynicism, that the next generation might inherit a system less scarred by bias. Later that evening, Carter walked quietly to the corner where it had all begun, the spot on 5th Street where Reynolds had shoved him against his own car. The city had placed a plaque there at the request of community leaders, a memorial not to one man's suffering but to every victim of misconduct. It read, "In recognition of the victims of police abuse and in commitment to justice and equality." Standing there, Carter noticed a young black boy reading the inscription aloud to his mother, his small voice carrying hope rather than fear. The boy looked up at Carter, not recognizing the director but seeing only a man who smiled back with reassurance. That look, unclouded by suspicion or prejudice, was the clearest proof that change was possible. Carter returned home late that night, his phone buzzing with messages from colleagues, advocates, and lawmakers, but the one message that mattered most came from his daughter. "Proud of you, Dad. You turned something terrible into something meaningful." He sat at his desk, reflecting on the irony that humiliation had become the catalyst for progress, that injustice had given birth to reform, and that his suffering had been transformed into a national reckoning. Justice, though delayed, had not been denied. It had been delivered, and from that delivery came renewal, not only for him, but for a country still learning to face its own reflection. The end. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I want to know what you think about how the plot unfolded. Was the twist more powerful when David Carter revealed who he really was, or when Reynolds finally faced his downfall in court? Tell me in the comments how you felt when power shifted, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts and perspectives add meaning to these stories, and I read every single one.